Echoes of Biafra, the story of Nkem and the Lost Horizon. Prologue, the calm before the storm. The Nigeria of Nkem's childhood was a land of contrasts and promise. His home in Onitsha, a thriving commercial town on the banks of the Niger River, was a hub of activity. Traders from across the country gathered there, their boats heavy with goods, yams, dried fish, cola nuts, and fabrics dyed in vibrant indigos and reds. Nkem often marveled at the diversity of the people he saw: Hausa men in flowing robes, Yoruba women with headscarves tied high, and his own Igbo kin dressed in simple but colorful clothes. At home, Nkem's life was full of warmth and structure. His father, Obi, was a schoolteacher, known for his discipline and love of books. He was a firm believer in Nigeria's unity, often reminding his children of the country's potential. "Nigeria is like a puzzle," Obi would say, pointing to a map on the wall. "Each piece is different, but together they make something beautiful." Nkem's mother, Ada, was the heart of the household. She had a way of making even the simplest meals. Yam porridge, smoked fish, and pepper soup taste like a feast. She was also a gifted storyteller, weaving tales of Igbo heroes and spirits that fascinated Nkem and his younger sister, Ifeoma. Yet, as Nkem grew older, he began to notice the cracks in the world his father so revered. News of ethnic violence in distant towns reached Onitsha, carried by grim-faced traders. The 1966 military coups, one in January and another in July, had shaken the country. The second coup, led by northern officers, had sparked widespread violence against the Igbo in the north. Refugees began arriving in Onitsha, their faces hollow with fear and grief. One evening, as the family gathered around their small radio, they heard news of another massacre. Obi switched off the radio, his hands trembling. "What's happening, Papa?" Nkem asked. Obi's face was grim. "Dark times, my son. Dark times." Act 1. The Declaration of Biafra. By 1967, the eastern region had become a refuge for Igbo people fleeing violence in the north. The atmosphere in Onitsha was tense but hopeful. When Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu declared the independence of Biafra on May 30th, the streets erupted in celebration. People sang and danced, waving the Biafran flag with its rising sun symbol. To many, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to live without fear. Nkem, now 16, was swept up in the excitement. He and his friends debated the future of their new nation. They spoke of building schools, factories, and a society where the Igbo could thrive. But Nkem's father was more cautious. "This independence is a bold step," Obi said one evening as the family ate dinner. "But boldness alone is not enough. Nigeria will not let Biafra go so easily." Ada, always practical, added, "If they bring war to us, we must be ready." The war came sooner than anyone expected. In July 1967, Nigerian federal troops invaded Biafra. The sound of shelling echoed across the land, and Onitsha, a key town along the Niger River, became a target. Act 2. The Bombing of Onitsha. The morning of the bombing began like any other. Nkem had gone to the market to buy cassava for his mother. The market was bustling with activity, women haggling over prices, children chasing each other, traders shouting their wares. But the air was heavy with tension. People glanced nervously at the sky, where Nigerian planes had been seen in recent days. The first bomb fell without warning. It struck a nearby building, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the air. Panic erupted. People screamed and scattered, overturning stalls in their rush to escape. Nkem froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Another bomb fell, then another, the explosions deafening. "Nkem, run!" a woman shouted, pulling him to his senses. He sprinted home, his legs aching, his lungs burning. When he reached his family's compound, he found only rubble. He screamed for his mother, his sister, his father, but there was no answer. Neighbors shouted that people had fled toward the river, seeking safety. Nkem followed the fleeing crowd, but he found no sign of his family. Desperate and alone, he joined a group of other displaced boys who were also searching for their families. Together, they began a harrowing journey to escape the advancing troops. The Exodus. The roads leading out of Onitsha were choked with refugees. Women carried children on their backs, men dragged carts piled high with meager belongings, and the elderly shuffled along, leaning on canes. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and smoke from distant fires. Nkem's group moved cautiously, avoiding main roads where soldiers might be. They survived by scavenging for food, wild fruits, scraps left behind by other refugees. Hunger gnawed at Nkem's belly, but worse was the uncertainty. Where were his mother and sister? Were they alive? One evening, as the group camped by the roadside, they met an elderly man named Papa Ekeni. He carried nothing but a walking stick and a small sack of dried yams. Despite his frailty, his voice was strong. "Do not lose hope, my children," he said. "The Igbo have faced hardship before, and we have always risen again. This war will not break us." His words were a small comfort to Nkem, who clung to the belief that his family was still alive. Life as a child soldier. After weeks of wandering, Nkem and his group stumbled into a Biafran army camp. The soldiers, desperate for recruits, conscripted the boys. Training was swift and brutal. Nkem learned to assemble a rifle, dig trenches, and navigate the bush. The officers drilled them relentlessly, shouting that they were the last line of defense for Biafra. Nkem's first battle was a chaotic blur. The Nigerian army attacked their position with superior firepower, and the Biafran soldiers fought desperately to hold their ground. Nkem fired his rifle blindly, his hands shaking. When the fighting ended, the ground was littered with bodies. Among the dead were some of his newfound friends. That night, Nkem sat by the fire, unable to eat. An older soldier named Chike sat beside him. "War is a terrible thing," Chike said, "but we fight because we must. If we don't, who will protect our people?" Nkem nodded, but the weight of what he had seen was almost too much to bear. Meeting Amara. Nkem met Amara during one of the most harrowing moments of his young life. He had been injured in a skirmish, a brutal ambush by Nigerian troops in a dense forest near Owerri. It was a miracle that he had survived. The explosion of a mortar round had thrown him to the ground, shrapnel tearing into his left leg. For hours, he lay in agony, unable to move, his rifle lying useless beside him. By the time his comrades found him, the wound was badly infected, and Nkem was feverish, his thoughts a haze of pain and fear. He was carried to a makeshift hospital in a small village hidden deep in Biafran-held territory. The hospital was a hastily converted schoolhouse, its classrooms now serving as wards. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat, blood, and disinfectant. Wounded soldiers and civilians lay on mats or wooden pallets, moaning softly or staring blankly at the ceiling. Nurses and doctors, most of them barely older than Nkem, moved among them, their faces etched with exhaustion. It was there that Amara entered his life. A healing touch. Amara was 19, just a few years older than Nkem, but the war had aged her far beyond her years. She had been working as a volunteer nurse since the early days of the conflict after losing her parents and 2 siblings in a bombing raid. She had no formal medical training, but necessity and determination had turned her into a skilled caregiver. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, and her presence a source of comfort in a world that seemed to offer none. When Nkem was brought in, she was immediately drawn to his condition. The infection in his leg was severe, and his fever was dangerously high. She crouched beside him, examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "This will hurt," she warned, her voice soft but firm. Nkem nodded weakly, too tired to speak. He gritted his teeth as she cleaned the wound, her hands working quickly to remove the shrapnel and dead tissue. Despite the pain, he couldn't help but notice the kindness in her eyes. They were large and expressive, reflecting both her sorrow and her resolve. "You're lucky they found you in time," she said as she bandaged his leg. "You'll be fine, just rest." Her words were a lifeline to Nkem. In the chaos of war, he had grown used to seeing death and despair. Amara's presence was like a ray of light piercing through the darkness. building trust. Over the following days, Amara became Nkem's primary caregiver. She checked his wound daily, ensuring it was healing properly, and coaxed him to eat the thin porridge that was all the hospital could provide. Despite the grim conditions, she maintained an air of quiet strength that inspired those around her. As Nkem's fever subsided and his strength returned, he began to talk to her. At first, their conversations were brief and guarded. He asked her about the other patients, and she told him their stories. Soldiers like him, civilians caught in crossfire, children who had lost everything. Her voice carried a mixture of sorrow and hope, as if she was determined to find meaning in the suffering around her. One evening, as she sat by his pallet, Amara asked, "What about you? Do you have family waiting for you?" The question caught Nkem off guard. He hadn't spoken of his family to anyone since the bombing of Onitsha. For a moment he hesitated, but something about Amara's presence made him feel safe. "I don't know if they're alive," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I lost them when the bombs fell. I've been searching ever since." Amara's eyes softened. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know what that feels like. I lost my family too." Her words created an unspoken bond between them. They were two young souls adrift in the storm of war, clinging to whatever fragments of hope they could find. The night raid. Their growing connection was tested one fateful night. Nigerian troops, advancing into Biafran territory, launched a surprise raid on the village where the hospital was located. The sound of gunfire shattered the stillness, and the air filled with shouts and screams. Nkem, still unable to walk properly, tried to sit up, his heart pounding with fear. Amara appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "We have to move," she said. "The soldiers are coming." With the help of another nurse, she lifted Nkem onto a makeshift stretcher. The hospital staff and patients fled into the surrounding forest, their path lit only by the moon and the occasional flash of gunfire. Nkem clutched his rifle, though he doubted he would be able to use it in his condition. As they ran, Nkem noticed Amara's unwavering focus. She guided the group through the dense undergrowth, her voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos. When a young boy tripped and fell, she stopped to help him, even as the sounds of the advancing troops grew louder. They eventually reached a safer location, a clearing deep in the forest where the group huddled together, their breaths ragged. Amara moved among them, tending to those who were injured or in shock. Her strength amazed Nkem. Even in the face of danger, she put the needs of others above her own. A new purpose. After the raid, Nkem's admiration for Amara deepened. She had not only saved his life, but had shown him what it meant to be truly selfless. As he recovered, he began to help her with her work, fetching water, assisting with bandages, and comforting younger patients. In doing so, he found a sense of purpose that had been missing since the war began. Amara encouraged him to keep going, even when the weight of his losses threatened to overwhelm him. "We can't change the past," she told him one evening as they sat by a fire, "but we can shape what comes next. Every life we save, every small act of kindness, it all matters." Her words stayed with Nkem, guiding him as he navigated the challenges of war. In Amara, he found not just a friend, but a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still light to be found. A quiet love. Over time, their bond grew into something deeper. It wasn't the kind of love born of courtship or romance. It was forged in the crucible of war, built on trust, shared pain, and a mutual determination to survive. They rarely spoke of their feelings directly, but their actions said enough. Amara would sit by Nkem's side when he couldn't sleep, her presence a balm for his troubled mind. In turn, he would protect her as fiercely as he would have his own family. Their connection gave Nkem the strength to continue. Though the war raged on, he began to believe that survival was not only possible, but necessary. For her, for himself, and for the countless others who depended on people like Amara. For Nkem, meeting Amara was not just a moment of salvation, it was a turning point. She reminded him of the humanity that war sought to strip away and gave him a reason to keep fighting. Not for revenge, but for the possibility of a better future. The famine. By 1968, Biafra was starving. The Nigerian blockade had cut off food and medical supplies, and the land could no longer sustain the population. Nkem saw children with swollen bellies and adults too weak to stand. He, too, grew gaunt, his ribs visible beneath his tattered uniform. Amara worked tirelessly, rationing what little food and medicine they had. She often gave her own portions to the most vulnerable, despite Nkem's protests. "You can't save everyone," he told her one night. "But I can try," she replied, her voice resolute. Their bond deepened during these difficult times. Amara became a symbol of hope for Nkem, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, humanity could endure. The end of the war. By January 1970, the Biafran dream had faded. The once vivid banners of the rising sun hung limp, the people too broken to wave them. The surrender, announced on January 15th, was broadcast over crackling radios and whispered through camps of starving soldiers and civilians. For Nkem, it felt like the world itself had ended. After nearly 3 years of brutal conflict, the Biafran leader, Odumegwu Ojukwu, fled into exile. The remaining leaders of Biafra, including Colonel Philip Effiong, formally capitulated to the Nigerian government. General Yakubu Gowon, Nigeria's head of state, declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished, promising reconciliation. But for the people of Biafra, the scars of war were too deep to heal with words. Nkem, now 19 and a shadow of his former self, returned to Onitsha. His once thriving hometown was a ghost of its former self. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, their charred remains standing as silent witnesses to the relentless bombings. The marketplaces that had once bustled with traders were now eerily empty, with only scavengers picking through the debris for anything of value. Nkem's first stop was the compound where his family had lived. The house was gone, replaced by a gaping hole where bombs had fallen. He wandered through the ruins, calling out for his mother, his sister Ifeoma, or anyone who might have survived. His voice echoed through the silence, but there was no reply. The long search. For weeks, Nkem combed the refugee camps around Onitsha and further afield. Each camp was a grim tableau of human suffering. Rows of makeshift tents stretched out, filled with gaunt, hollow-eyed survivors. Many were so weak from hunger and disease that they could barely lift their heads. Yet Nkem pressed on, driven by the faint hope that he might find his family. At one camp, he met an old neighbor who had fled Onitsha during the early days of the war. The man recognized Nkem immediately, his face lighting up with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Nkem," he said, grasping the boy's bony shoulders, "I saw your mother and Ifeoma in the early days, just after the bombing. They were heading toward the river, but after that, I don't know." The man's words filled Nkem with both hope and despair. His family had survived the initial bombing, but where were they now? Were they even alive? The questions gnawed at him as he continued his search. A town in ruins. Onitsha, once a vibrant center of trade and culture, was now a wasteland. The bridges that had connected the town to other parts of Nigeria lay in ruins, their twisted metal carcasses jutting out over the Niger River. The river itself, once a symbol of life and commerce, now carried the detritus of war. Broken boats, shattered wood, and the occasional grim sight of a lifeless body floating downstream. Nkem walked through the streets, his heart heavy with memories of what had been. He passed the school where his father had taught, now reduced to rubble. He knelt beside the ruins and wept, the weight of his grief finally overwhelming him. But amid the devastation, there were signs of life. Groups of survivors began to emerge from hiding, cautiously reclaiming the town. Women with hollow cheeks swept the dust from their doorsteps. Men with weary eyes started to rebuild, stacking bricks and clearing debris. Nkem found himself drawn to these efforts. Though his personal loss was immense, he felt a deep need to help restore what remained of his community. One evening, as Nkem helped clear rubble from what had once been a community hall, he heard a familiar voice call his name. He turned to see Amara, her frame as thin as his, but her eyes still bright with determination. She wore a faded dress and carried a small bundle of medical supplies. "Amara!" he cried, running to her. He embraced her, tears streaming down his face. Amara smiled weakly. "I heard you were back," she said. "I've been working in the camps. There's so much to do." The sight of her was a balm to his wounded spirit. They sat together on the steps of the ruined hall, sharing stories of their separate journeys. Amara told him how she had continued her work as a nurse, moving from one makeshift hospital to another, often under fire. "There were times I wanted to give up," she admitted. "But then I thought of people like you, people who believed in Biafra, not just the nation, but the idea of a better world. That kept me going." Nkem felt a surge of hope. In Amara, he saw the resilience of Biafra itself, a spirit that refused to be broken. Reconciliation and rebuilding. As the weeks turned into months, Nkem threw himself into the task of rebuilding Onitsha. He joined a team of volunteers working to repair roads and clear the rubble from bombed-out buildings. Using the engineering skills he had learned before the war, he helped design makeshift shelters for displaced families. Amara continued her work in the camps, tending to the sick and distributing food. She and Nkem often worked together, their shared purpose drawing them closer. In the evenings, they would sit by the river and talk about their dreams for the future. "Do you think we can ever rebuild what we've lost?" Nkem asked one night. Amara took his hand. "Not exactly as it was," she said, "but maybe something better, something stronger." Their conversations often turned to the question of reconciliation. General Gowon's promise of "no victor, no vanquished" was a noble sentiment, but in practice, the wounds of war ran deep. Many Igbo felt betrayed by their fellow Nigerians, and trust would take years, if not decades, to rebuild. For Nkem, reconciliation began with small acts. He reached out to former neighbors who had fled during the war, offering to help them rebuild their homes. He spoke to the younger boys in the camps, urging them to stay in school and believe in the possibility of a brighter future. By the time Nkem turned 25, Onitsha was beginning to show signs of revival. Markets reopened, schools were rebuilt, and the town's famous bridge over the Niger River was reconstructed. Nkem, now a qualified engineer, played a key role in these efforts. His projects often focused on connecting people, literally and figuratively, by building bridges, roads, and other infrastructure. Amara, too, remained a guiding light in the community. She established a small clinic, providing much-needed healthcare to the town's residents. She and Nkem became partners not only in their work, but in life, their shared experiences forging an unbreakable bond. Yet the legacy of Biafra was never far from their minds. They often spoke to younger generations about the war, not to sow bitterness, but to ensure the lessons were never forgotten. Biafra was more than a war, Nkem would tell the children who gathered around him. It was a dream of freedom and dignity. And even though the dream was interrupted, it doesn't mean it's over. We can still build a world where everyone is treated with respect, no matter where they come from. Decades later, Nkem would look back on his life with a mixture of sorrow and pride. The war had taken so much from him, his family, his innocence, his homeland. But it had also taught him the value of resilience, community, and hope. On the anniversary of Biafra's surrender, Nkem stood on the banks of the Niger River, now bustling with life once more. The rising sun reflected on the water, a reminder of the symbol that had once flown on the Biafran flag. As he watched the sunrise, Nkem whispered a prayer for all those who had been lost and for all those who continued to dream.